In the heart of the Middle Ages, one of the most enigmatic and powerful orders in history emerged, the Knights Templar. Born after the First Crusade, these warrior monks swore to protect pilgrims traveling to the Holy Land. But over time, they became much more than mere guardians of the road. They were soldiers, bankers, diplomats, and custodians of secrets that still today continue to arouse mystery and fascination. From their humble beginnings in Jerusalem to their expansion throughout Europe, the Templars created an unprecedented network of political, economic, and religious power. They founded castles that were impossible to conquer, accumulated wealth comparable to that of kings, and managed the first systems of international credit and banking. Figures such as Hugo de Payens, its founder, or Godfrey of Saint-Omer, its first companion, were the pillars of a brotherhood moved by honor and obedience to Christian Bushido that they called the rule of the Temple. On the battlefields of Hattin, Acre, and Damietta, the Templars faced Muslim armies led by Saladin, resisting until their last breath, faithful to their oath never to surrender. Warriors such as Jacques de Molay, its last Grand Master, died with the name of God on their lips and their heads held high in the face of the treachery of the powerful. Introduction: the birth of a sacred order. At the dawn of the 12th century, the Christian world looked to the east with unprecedented fervor. Jerusalem, the holy city where Christ had been crucified and resurrected according to Scripture, had returned to Christian hands after the First Crusade. Bells rang from Rome to Paris, announcing that the roads to the Holy Sepulchre were open again. However, this victory brought with it a latent threat. The routes to the Holy Land were infested with bandits, looters, and Muslim factions that harassed the defenseless pilgrims. In that context of faith, violence, and ambition, an idea arose that would change the destiny of Europe and Christianity forever. In the year 1119, a French knight of noble birth, Hugh de Payens, accompanied by 8 other men, appeared before King Baldwin II of Jerusalem with a proposal as simple as it was revolutionary: to form a brotherhood of warrior monks. Its purpose was to protect the Christian pilgrims who traveled the roads between the coast and the holy city. They did not seek wealth or glory, but to serve God with the sword in one hand and the cross in the breast. The king, moved by their devotion, gave them a place to settle, a sector of the ancient enclosure of Solomon's Temple on Mount Moriah, which had been converted into a royal palace after the conquest of Jerusalem. That location, loaded with biblical symbolism, marked the birth of one of the most mysterious and powerful orders in history, the Order of the Poor Knights of Christ and of Solomon's Temple, known to posterity as the Knights Templar. His first days were austere. The 9 founders lived under vows of poverty, shared a single horse, and wore simple tunics, without insignia or ornaments. But his discipline and faith were unwavering. In a world where war and religion were intertwined without distinction, his example embodied a new ideal of chivalry, a soldier who fought not out of ambition but out of devotion. For years, the Templars operated in near anonymity. They guarded roads, escorted caravans, faced ambushes. They were monks who prayed at dawn and knights who wielded their swords at noon. His reputation grew among the crusaders and pilgrims who survived thanks to his protection. However, his real expansion began when his cause was heard in the West by an influential figure, Saint Bernard of Clairvaux, abbot of the monastery of Citeaux, and one of the most respected men in Christendom. Bernard saw in these knights a pure form of militant faith. He described them as knights of the Lord, who were not afraid to die because their souls were consecrated to divine justice. Thanks to his influence, the Order of the Temple obtained official recognition from the Church at the Council of Troyes in 1129 under the protection of Pope Honorius II. From that moment on, the Templars were not simple pious warriors. They were an ecclesiastical institution with its own rules, spiritual privileges, and an authority that answered only to the Pope. The fame of the Templars spread quickly throughout Europe. Knights from all over Christendom, nobles and peasants alike, offered their lands, wealth, and inheritances to the order. Many young men renounced their titles to wear the white robe and take the vows of poverty, chastity, and obedience. Before long, the Templars became a network of spiritual and economic power that transcended borders. They founded houses, commanderies, and fortresses from Scotland to the Holy Land, uniting the Christian West under the same ideal, the defense of the faith. The context of the Crusades. At the end of the 11th century, Europe was undergoing a profound transformation. Centuries of invasions, famine, and feudalism had left a continent divided, where religion was the only force capable of uniting warring kingdoms and peoples. Pilgrimages to the Holy Land multiplied, but reaching Jerusalem meant crossing a hostile world: deserts, tribes, local wars, and Muslim domains. For more than 4 centuries, the Holy City had remained under Islamic control. For Christians, the Holy Sepulchre, that is, the tomb of Christ, was an inaccessible sacred place desecrated by infidels. In the year 1095, Pope Urban II, alarmed by the news coming from the east, convened a council at Clermont, France. There, before a crowd of bishops, nobles, and peasants, he gave a speech that would change the course of the medieval world. In a firm voice, he urged Christians to take up arms in the name of God and liberate Jerusalem from Muslim hands. To those who participated in the expedition, he promised total forgiveness of their sins. It was the beginning of what history would remember as the First Crusade. That call ignited a fever of faith and fanaticism. Tens of thousands of men and women left their homes, marching into the unknown under the symbol of the cross sewn into their robes. Some sought redemption, others land or fortune, but all believed they served a divine cause. Between 1096 and 1099, armies made up of peasants, mercenaries, and nobles advanced through Eastern Europe until they reached Constantinople, capital of the Byzantine Empire. From there, they crossed into Asia Minor, facing famine, disease, and incessant fighting. On July 15, 1099, after 3 years of suffering, the Crusaders achieved their goal. Jerusalem was conquered. The chronicles narrate that the streets were covered in blood and that religious fervor was mixed with the brutality of war. In the eyes of Christians, God's will had been accomplished. The Kingdom of Jerusalem was then born, a Christian state in the midst of the Muslim world, sustained by the sword and faith. However, the victory brought new challenges. The distances between Europe and the Holy Land made it impossible to maintain a stable defense. Pilgrims arriving from the west were easy prey for bandits and local tribes. The Crusader castles, scattered throughout Syria, Palestine, and the coast of Lebanon, needed disciplined men capable of living under religious vows but also of wielding weapons with skill. In that power vacuum arose the idea of a holy militia, a corps of consecrated warriors that would unite monastic discipline with the art of war. The ideal of the holy war was then consolidated as part of medieval thought. It was not only a political enterprise but a spiritual mission. Soldiers who died fighting in the name of Christ were considered martyrs, and their sacrifice ensured eternal salvation. Violence, for the first time, was clothed in holiness. The knight's sword was transformed into an instrument of redemption. Along with this religious fervor, the Crusades aroused the economic and political interest of the great European kingdoms. The control of the Mediterranean trade routes, the expansion of territories, and the accumulation of wealth were mixed with spiritual discourse. Venetian, Genoese, and Pisanian merchants accompanied the Crusaders, opening new routes to the east. The crusade was as much a war of faith as it was an opportunity for conquest. Meanwhile, in the Holy Land, the new Christian kingdoms were surrounded by enemies. To the north, the Seljuk Turks threatened from Anatolia. To the south, the Fatimids of Egypt were cautiously watching the European advance. The survival of the Kingdom of Jerusalem depended on a permanent defense, and most of the Crusaders who had conquered the city returned to Europe after fulfilling their vow. Only a few remained, willing to hold Christendom's frontier in the east. It was in this scenario, around the year 1119, that a group of French knights led by Hugh de Payens proposed to King Baldwin II a unique idea: to form an order that would combine religious life with military mission. Their goal was not to conquer or rule, but to protect pilgrims who came from the west to visit the holy sites. These men renounced their property, swore obedience and poverty, and settled in the remains of Solomon's ancient temple on Mount Moriah. That gesture, apparently modest, marked the birth of a new type of knight, the warrior monk. Until then, the Church had seen violence as a sin, but the Crusades transformed that perception. Fighting for Christ was an act of faith, and death in battle a direct path to paradise. Christian spirituality was mixed with the feudal code of honor, creating a morality where sacrifice and combat merged into a single virtue. The initial success of the Crusades consolidated this thought. Pope Paschal II and later Honorius II encouraged the creation of military religious orders to defend the Holy Territories. Along with the Templars, others would emerge, such as the Knights Hospitaller and later the Teutonic Knights. Each had a role to play in the defense of the faith, but the Templars, with their fervor and austerity, soon stood out as the purest example of the Crusader ideal. In the following years, as tensions with Islam intensified and new crusades were called, the figure of the Knight Templar began to take on a mythical dimension. Papal approval and the rule of the Temple. For the first years of their existence, the Templars lived in anonymity. They were few, poor and unknown. They slept on the stone floor, shared horses, and ate just enough to survive. His strength lay in discipline and a faith that did not break in the face of fatigue or defeat. But that little brotherhood in Jerusalem was destined to expand far beyond the walls of Solomon's ancient temple. Their destiny began to be defined when one of the most influential voices in medieval Christianity heard about them, Bernard of Clairvaux. Saint Bernard was the abbot of the Cistercian monastery of Citeaux in Burgundy and one of the leading theologians of his time. His word moved kings, inspired crusades, and shaped the morals of Europe. At a time when sanctity and war seemed opposites, Bernard found in the Templars a perfect synthesis. They were monks who prayed and knights who fought. He saw in them a new form of devotion, the spirituality of the holy warrior. Fascinated by their austerity, their silence, and their sacrifice, he decided to intercede with the Pope to give them legitimacy. In 1129, during the Council of Troyes, held in the region of Champagne, the Templars officially presented their cause to the Church. Its leader, Hugh de Payens, laid out his mission to bishops, abbots, and papal representatives. He explained how they had sworn to protect the pilgrims and defend the roads to Jerusalem. They were not seeking privileges or riches, but a rule that would guide their lives under the principles of the gospel. On that day, the history of the order changed forever. Pope Honorius II, impressed by his devotion and by the support of St. Bernard, approved the foundation of the Order of the Poor Knights of Christ and the Temple of Solomon. With this, the Church officially recognized the Templars as a religious institution under its direct protection. Thus, a new category was born within Christianity, the monastic military order, in which the contemplative life and holy war were united under the same ideal. The document that defined its existence was the Regula Pauperum Commilitonum Christi Templique Salomonici, known as the Rule of the Temple. Written by St. Bernard and inspired by the strict discipline of the Cistercians, this rule regulated every aspect of Templar life: their food, their clothing, their prayers, and their conduct in battle. The Templars had to obey three fundamental vows: poverty, chastity, and obedience. They could not own personal property or maintain family or emotional relationships. Everything they had belonged to the order and ultimately to God. The rule forbade ostentation, luxury, and vanity. The Templars wore unadorned white cloaks, a symbol of purity, and wore their hair short and beards unshaven. Their meals were frugal, and silence was mandatory in the refectories. They slept dressed, with their sword belts always at hand, ready to mount horses at any time. Prayer marked the rhythm of his days, but obedience was his most sacred virtue. A Templar had to obey the order of his superior without hesitation, even if it meant death. The rule also established the rules of engagement. A Templar should not retreat as long as the temple's banner was still standing. He had to protect his brother in arms, never leave the battlefield without permission, and maintain discipline even in the chaos of war. Cowardice was considered a spiritual offense. Whoever fled from the enemy fled from God. For this reason, the Templar ranks moved as a single body, closed, compact, guided by a will that seemed more divine than human. The power of that rule lay not only in its severity, but in the purity of its purpose. While the European nobles fought for land and honor, the Templars did so for the salvation of the soul. Their combat was a form of penance. By killing, they thought they were purifying themselves, when we die, to attain eternal glory. St. Bernard defended this paradox in his famous treatise, In Praise of the New Chivalry, where he described the Templars as knights without fear, who live without pleasure and die without fear. In his words, the Templar was not just an order, but a spiritual army in the service of heaven. Papal approval granted the Templars exceptional privileges. They were exempt from paying taxes, freed from all secular authority and subject only to the Pope. They could build churches, cemeteries, and fortresses without episcopal authorization, administer justice within their domains, and own land donated by the faithful. No bishop or king could judge a Templar. This autonomy was the foundation of its future power. With the backing of the Church and the blessing of the Pontiff, the Order of the Temple expanded rapidly. Nobles donated castles and estates, families gave up their children, and pilgrims entrusted their goods into their hands. Within a few years, the Templars became a spiritual and economic network connecting east to west. Their houses and encomiendas flourished in France, England, Portugal, Castile, Aragon, and Italy, while in the Holy Land they built fortresses that resisted the siege of the desert. The rule, copied and distributed throughout Europe, was more than a religious code. It was a model of organization and discipline. Each member, from the highest maester to the youngest squire, knew his duty and his place. The temple was a machine of faith and war, moved by obedience and guided by the conviction that every act, every combat, and every prayer had a divine purpose. The symbol of the temple and its meaning. Few emblems have endured as strongly in the collective memory as the red cross of the Knights Templar. It was a kicked cross whose arms widened towards the ends, embroidered on the white mantle that represented purity and devotion. At that time, the color and shape of a cross could mean the difference between a pilgrim, a hospitaller, or a crusader. But the temple cross became more than just a military insignia. It was the sign of a sacred mission, a constant reminder that their cause was spiritual rather than earthly. Pope Eugene III in 1147, during the pontificate that coincided with the Second Crusade, officially authorized the Templars to wear the red cross over their white habit. That papal permission was more than a privilege. The red symbolized the blood of Christ shed in the sacrifice, but also the willingness of the Knight Templar to shed his own in defense of the faith. White, on the other hand, evoked chastity and purity of spirit. The combination of both colors visually defined the balance between sacrifice and redemption, between the body that fights and the soul that prays. The cross was not a mere ornament, it was a visible oath. Every Templar had to remember that he bore on his chest the sign of martyrdom. Before wearing the mantle, he performed a solemn ceremony before the altar where he swore to obey the vows and live under the rule. The Grand Master or chaplain imposed the mantle on him and said, "Receive this white tunic, a symbol of purity and chastity. May you serve the Lord under it without fear or blemish." From that moment on, the knight became a Miles Christi, a soldier of Christ. The Templars were aware of the symbolic power of his image. On the battlefields, they advanced under the banner of the temple, called Beauseant, half black and half white, with the red cross standing out in its center. White represented the purity of his intentions, black the harshness with which they treated the enemies of the faith. The motto that accompanied their campaigns, "Not to us, Lord, not to us, but to your name give glory," was intoned before the charge, when the spears bowed and the hooves resounded in unison. Unlike other Crusader armies, the Templars marched in silence. Their faith was their rallying cry. The enemy saw an impeccable formation, white and red, disciplined, approaching without fear or doubt. Muslim chronicles describe its advance as that of a wave that does not stop. The cross on his breasts became a symbol of spiritual and military power, feared and revered in equal measure. In the deserts of Syria and Palestine, that figure became synonymous with fanaticism and courage. But the symbol of the temple was not only manifested in his clothing. Each castle, fortress, or encomienda they founded had the cross engraved on its walls and coats of arms. It was the seal of the order, printed on documents, coins, and wax seals. The most famous of all showed two knights riding on the same horse, an image that alluded to the original poverty of the founders. He represented humility and Templar fraternity, sharing the burden, living in community, fighting as one. It also symbolized the duality of their nature, monks and warriors, body and soul, sacrifice and obedience. Over the centuries, that seal fed multiple interpretations. Some considered it an allegory of his vow of poverty, others a representation of the balance between earthly and spiritual life. In later times, when the mystery of the temple began to envelop its legacy, that same image would be seen as an esoteric emblem, charged with occult meanings. But in its origins, there was nothing enigmatic. It was a declaration of principles, the expression of a faith that was not divided between the sword and prayer. The geometric design of the kicked cross also had a profound symbolic value. Its expansion to the extremes evoked the radiance of the gospel to the four cardinal points, a call to take the Christian faith to the ends of the known world. In their simple forms and exact proportions, some historians have seen Byzantine or even Oriental influences acquired during contact with the artisans of the Holy Land. For the Templars, however, its meaning was unmistakable. The red cross was their banner of obedience and their shield against evil. The Templar cross also appeared in the objects of the order's daily life. It was carved on the hilts of swords, embroidered on horse blankets, and engraved on the stones of private chapels where knights prayed before battle. On Templar coins, the cross divided the front and back fields, reminding us that every act, even economic act, had to pay tribute to God. Each symbol, each gesture reinforced the idea that the Templars were part of a sacred, indivisible body whose identity did not reside in blood or lineage, but in the cross they carried. In medieval culture, the power of the symbol was absolute. Images were language, and the temple understood that its strength depended as much on the sword as on the image it projected. Wherever his banner waved, respect prevailed. His red cross was a message. Faith rules here. In the eyes of the pilgrims, it represented security, for enemies an omen of death. Jerusalem and Solomon's Temple Fortress. In the heart of Jerusalem, on Mount Moriah, stood the ruins of Solomon's Temple, the holiest site in Judaism and one of the most revered sites by the three monotheistic religions. According to biblical tradition, Abraham was willing to sacrifice his son Isaac there, and there King Solomon built his majestic temple, a symbol of the covenant between God and Israel. Centuries later, that mountain, devastated by wars and conquests, witnessed the birth of one of the most powerful institutions of the Middle Ages. When the Crusaders conquered Jerusalem in 1099, they made the Temple Mount complex their stronghold, and the Knights Templar settled on its foundations. King Baldwin II of Jerusalem, recognizing the courage and devotion of Hugh de Payens and his companions, granted them a residence within the compound in what had been the Al-Aqsa Mosque, built on the site that tradition identified as the ancient Temple of Solomon. That gesture not only provided them with a refuge, it granted them a symbol. From that moment on, the Templars were known as the Poor Knights of Solomon's Temple, and their headquarters became the spiritual and military center of the order. The building, with its wide courtyards, underground passageways, and gilded stone walls, was adapted for the needs of the knights. The chronicles describe a sober and functional complex, stables capable of housing hundreds of horses, prayer rooms, workshops, dormitories, kitchens, and arsenals. But what impressed the pilgrims most was the severe discipline that reigned there. No profane noise disturbed the prayer, no soldier dared to cross the gates without due reverence. Mount Moriah had become a sacred fortress, a mixture of monastery and barracks, where each stone evoked the memory of the divine. The location could not be more symbolic. According to Christian tradition, Jesus had preached on that same mountain. The Crusaders considered it a ground sanctified by God's presence. For the Templars, living and fighting on those ruins was a constant reminder of their mission to protect the holy places and keep alive the flame of faith in the heart of the enemy. But that connection with the biblical temple also fueled the first legends about the secrets they kept inside. From the early years of the order, rumors began to circulate about underground excavations carried out by the Templars under the esplanade. Some said that they were looking for Solomon's treasures, others who had found sacred relics, such as the Ark of the Covenant, the Staff of Moses, or even the Holy Grail. Although no historical evidence confirms these stories, medieval accounts cemented the image of the Templars as custodians of occult knowledge. The tunnels of Mount Moriah became a symbol of its secret power, and its silence the most powerful evidence of its mystery. The legends multiplied over the centuries. Some Muslim chroniclers claimed that the Templars had found ancient scriptures and arcane symbols hidden under the temple. In the Christian West, the mystics claimed that the order kept sacred objects under lock and key that the Church had lost centuries earlier. The idea that the Templars guarded a divine secret, a knowledge inherited from Solomon himself, would endure long after their disappearance. That association with ancient wisdom transformed their image. They were no longer just warrior monks, but heirs to a spiritual tradition that transcended history. On the material plane, Solomon's Temple functioned as the administrative center of the order in the East. From there, military operations, supply routes, and exchange with the encomiendas of Europe were coordinated. Every shipment of money, arms, or provisions departed under the seal of the temple. Their system was so efficient that many kingdoms relied on their logistical services to keep the Crusades alive. The Templar compound in Jerusalem was a city within the city, with blacksmith shops, weapons depots, and a perfectly defined hierarchy. The site also housed the temple's main chapel, where knights gathered to pray before each campaign. The ceremonies were simple, without ornaments, but imbued with solemnity. The silence was interrupted only by Gregorian chant and the metallic clatter of armor. The prayers asked for strength to fight and purity to die. Many Templars vowed not to return alive if the mission was sacred. They believed that to die in Jerusalem was to die at the center of the world. The prestige of having its headquarters above Solomon's temple strengthened the mystical aura of the order. At a time when relics and symbols defined spiritual power, the Templars could claim to have their dwelling place above the very place where God had spoken to the prophets. No other order could claim such a powerful inheritance. Over time, the image of the temple became confused with that of the biblical temple itself, a construction of faith, wisdom, and mystery. When Jerusalem fell back into Muslim hands in 1187, following the victory of Salah ad-Din, known in the West as Saladin, the Templars were forced to abandon their fortress. The loss of Mount Moriah marked the beginning of the decline of Christian power in the Holy Land. The order moved its headquarters first to St. John of Acre and then to Cyprus. But its link with Jerusalem was never broken. In each fortress they built, in each church they consecrated, they reproduced the layout and orientation of the ancient temple. It was a way of keeping alive the promise of returning. Expansion in Europe. Following its papal approval and the consolidation of its headquarters in Jerusalem, the Order of the Temple began an unprecedented expansion. In less than a century, the Templars transformed from a small brotherhood of 9 knights into an organization that spread its influence throughout the European continent. Their Crusader emblem appeared on castles, farms, churches, and harbors. Wherever there was a trade route, a border, or a pilgrim's path, the Templars were present. Their faith was their standard, but their discipline and structure also made them an economic and political power that no king could ignore. The starting point of this expansion was France, the birthplace of its founders. In regions such as Champagne, Burgundy, and Normandy, nobles began donating land, castles, and villages to the order. These donations were not simple acts of charity. Many considered them a spiritual investment. Giving a portion of his inheritance to the Templars meant winning God's favor and securing perpetual prayers. Over time, the order became the owner of extensive agricultural and livestock domains known as Templar encomiendas. Each encomienda was a self-sufficient community. It had its church, its mill, its stables, and its orchard. The brothers who administered them, known as Brothers of the Land, were not knights of war, but monks dedicated to work and prayer. They cultivated the fields, raised cattle, and produced oil, wine, and grain. Everything that exceeded local consumption was sent to the ports of the Mediterranean, from where the ships of the temple departed for the Holy Land. The Templars achieved what no feudal army had ever achieved, an international logistical system, precisely coordinated and sustained by faith. In England, King Henry II Plantagenet granted extensive privileges to the order. London became one of its most important centres in Western Europe. There they built the famous Temple Church, inaugurated in 1185, a circular church inspired by the Holy Sepulchre in Jerusalem. Around it arose the Temple of London, a fortified complex that housed knights, scribes, accountants, and chaplains. Over time, that place became a symbol of power and justice, and centuries later, the seat of English law. In the Iberian Peninsula, the Templar presence took on a different dimension. In the Christian kingdoms of Castile, Aragon, and Portugal, the Templars actively participated in the Reconquista, fighting the Muslims who dominated the peninsula. The Christian kings granted them lands, fortresses, and privileges in exchange for their military service. In Aragon, they were granted the fortress of Monzon, from where they organized campaigns to the south. In Portugal, their influence was even greater. They helped King Afonso Henriques in the formation of the new kingdom, and after the dissolution of the order in the 14th century, their assets would be inherited by the Order of Christ, which would perpetuate their legacy in the age of maritime discovery. In Italy, the Templars established houses in Genoa, Pisa, and Venice, cities that were essential for the transport of crusaders and goods to the east. In Germany and the Baltic countries, his example inspired the creation of new orders, such as the Teutonic Order, which adopted much of his organization and discipline. In Hungary and Poland, their castles served as a refuge for pilgrims crossing the Carpathian Mountains. Their expansion knew no borders. Where there was a frontier of faith, the Templars built a fortress. The secret of his success was not only in devotion, but in his administrative efficiency. Each commandery was accountable to the provincial master and the latter to the Grand Master in Jerusalem. Reports circulated regularly through a network of messengers, ships, and caravans. Information, orders, and resources flowed uninterrupted from Scotland to Syria. No other medieval institution, not even the Church, had such a centralized and effective structure. The Temple became a transnational organization at a time when kingdoms were still struggling to define themselves. Their exclusive loyalty to the Pope made them independent of monarchs, which aroused both admiration and suspicion. In some places, they were seen as protectors, in others as a parallel power that acted beyond royal authority. Their ability to mobilize troops, money, and resources gave them enormous political influence. The Templars were, in the eyes of many rulers, an army within the Christian army. The Templar castles were true stone fortresses, built with a precision that combined military engineering with monastic spirituality. In France, the fortress of La Couvertoirade dominated the southern routes. In Spain, the castle of Ponferrada stood as a bastion of faith. In Portugal, the castle of Tomar became the nerve center of the order on the peninsula. Their architecture followed a common pattern: square towers, thick walls, internal chapels, and courtyards that served both for prayer and defense. Each stone represented the union between the temple and the sword. Over time, the temple accumulated enormous wealth, although its individual members remained faithful to the vow of poverty. The money came from donations, agricultural income, spoils of war, and deposits entrusted by pilgrims and nobles. That fortune was not used for luxury, but to sustain the Crusades, finance constructions, and guarantee the safety of travelers to the Holy Land. Without intending to, the Templars had created an economic network that anticipated the modern world, an interconnected system of goods, services, and transportation governed by trust and obedience. The birth of Templar banking. The expansion of the Temple throughout Europe not only extended its military and spiritual power, but gave rise to an entirely new phenomenon in Western history: the birth of an organized financial system. In a world where gold and silver coins were transported in chests escorted by soldiers, the Templars offered something revolutionary: security and confidence. In a few decades, the warrior monks who had sworn poverty became, paradoxically, the guardians of Christendom's greatest fortunes. The genesis of this transformation was practical rather than ideological. Pilgrims traveling to the Holy Land had to travel thousands of kilometers, crossing bandit-infested kingdoms, mountains, and seas. Carrying cash was a constant risk. The Templars, whose network of encomiendas stretched from Scotland to Jerusalem, devised a method that combined faith and accounting: the Templar credit system. A traveler could deposit his money in a house of the temple in Paris or London, receive a stamped document, and collect the equivalent sum in Acre, Cyprus, or Antioch. That paper, written with encrypted signs and symbols of the order, was the first antecedent of the modern bank check. That system was based on the order's incorruptible reputation. No one doubted the word Templar, and no thief dared to steal from the men of the temple. The encomiendas functioned as deposit, loan, and currency exchange offices. The Templars recorded every transaction on meticulously filed parchments. They used advanced accounting signs and a numeral system inherited from the Arabs, which allowed them to keep accurate records at a time when most nobles could barely write. Their efficiency was such that Italian merchants and European crowns began to entrust them with their treasures. The Templars did not charge interest in the modern sense, as usury was forbidden by the Church. However, they applied donations or custody charges, legal formulas that allowed them to obtain benefits without violating Christian doctrine. The deposits generated returns for the order, which were reinvested in the construction of castles, the purchase of weapons, and the financing of the Crusades. Thus, money flowed in an invisible network that linked the fields of Europe with the deserts of Palestine. The kings were the first to realize the potential of that system. Henry II of England used the Templars as treasurers of the crown. Louis VII of France trusted them to guard the funds of the Second Crusade, and in Spain, Alfonso I of Aragon bequeathed them part of his kingdom in his will. The papacy also depended on its network to send tribute, alms, and bulls to the Holy Land. The Order of the Templar had become an international bank, exempt from taxes, protected by pontifical authority, and present in the main commercial centers of the Christian world. At their Paris headquarters, located in the Temple de la Ville, the knights built a large fortified tower that served as Europe's treasure. Those thick stone walls housed chests of gold, jewels, property deeds, and sacred relics. It was an inviolable place. Not even the King of France could enter without the permission of the master. The chronicles relate that the funds of the kingdom, the tributes of the Pope, and the deposits of the noble families were kept there. The Temple of Paris was the financial heart of the continent, and its crypts functioned as the direct antecedent of a central bank. In addition to storing and transferring money, the Templars acted as economic intermediaries. They financed expeditions, granted loans to nobles, and managed inheritances and rents. His network of messengers transported gold, silver, and encrypted documents with an efficiency that amazed contemporaries. At a time when kingdoms communicated by horses and parchments, the Templars achieved a level of coordination that anticipated medieval globalization. Their economic power grew to such an extent that they could sustain armies, rebuild fortifications, and provide food for thousands of men for years. When a king needed money for a war, he turned to them. When a nobleman had to pay a ransom or finance a crusade, it was the temple that advanced the funds. Philip II Augustus of France himself trusted them to organize the resources of the Third Crusade. The order had become the banker of kings. The key to their success lay in absolute trust. The rule of the temple forbade stealing, lying, and deception under penalty of excommunication and expulsion. Each brother swore fidelity to the Pope and obedience to the master. That integrity was the basis of their power. The Christian world saw in the Templars not only soldiers of Christ, but guardians of honesty in a time dominated by corruption. Faith was his guarantee, and the word temper was equivalent to assurance. But the growth of his fortune also generated envy and suspicion. In the eyes of many, warrior monks had been transformed into merchants. His wealth contrasted with his vow of poverty. Their castles, their fleets, and their treasures aroused suspicion among the indebted kings and the ambitious clergy. Money, which had been an instrument of faith, was beginning to be his greatest danger. In France, the Templars lent immense sums to the crown, making the monarchs their debtors. Among them was Philip IV the Fair, a king as powerful as he was insolvent, whose relationship with the order would end in tragedy. Without intending to, the Templars had invented the tools of the modern financial system: credit, transfer, bill of exchange, and the receipt, and they had done it in the name of God. The myth of the Templar treasures. From the earliest days of its existence, the Order of the Templar was shrouded in an aura of mystery. Its wealth, autonomy, and silence fueled rumors that spread throughout Europe. But among all the myths that surrounded them, none achieved as much strength or persistence as that of their hidden treasures. Gold, sacred relics, forbidden manuscripts, and divine objects were part of the imaginary that was woven around the Templars. Over time, the temple's treasure became a symbol, the echo of a vanished fortune and of a knowledge lost in the shadows of history. At the time of their splendor, the Templars controlled castles, ports, farms, mines, and merchant fleets. Their efficient management and international banking system allowed them to accumulate large reserves of precious metals. But the true magnitude of its riches was never known. The order was not answerable to kings, and only the Grand Master and the General Treasury had access to the records of their assets. The vaults of the temple in Paris and other sites in London, Aragon, or Cyprus kept chests sealed with wax and secret symbols. By the time the order was dissolved in 1312, many of those chests had disappeared. The first testimony of a lost treasure appears shortly after the mass arrest of the Templars, ordered by King Philip IV of France in October 1307. According to the chroniclers of the time, when the king's men broke into the Temple of Paris, they did not find a single gold coin. The chambers were empty, the chests open, the inventories absent. Everything seemed to have been removed shortly before the raid. That absence fueled a question that would resonate for centuries. Where did the gold of the temple go? Legends offer many answers. Some accounts claim that days before the arrests, a Templar fleet set sail from the port of La Rochelle on France's Atlantic coast, loaded with chests, relics, and secret documents. It is said that it disappeared at sea, heading for uncertain destinations, Scotland, Portugal, or even the Americas, according to the later versions. In Scotland, later 15th century chronicles claimed that the refugee Templars fought alongside Robert the Bruce at the Battle of Bannockburn, and that they took the lost treasure with them. In Portugal, the Order of Christ would be founded, direct heir to the temple, which would have preserved part of its wealth and symbols. Another theory holds that the Templars hid their goods underground, in tunnels and secret crypts. Excavations carried out in ancient Templar sites, such as the Castle of Guisers in Normandy or that of Tomar in Portugal, have fueled the myth. In Guisers, legend has it that a gardener in the 12th century discovered a sealed chamber with silver chests and manuscripts, which mysteriously disappeared after the intervention of the authorities. No archaeological evidence confirmed this, but the rumor survived the passage of centuries. In Tomar, the convent's basements are filled with enclosed passages and blocked galleries, where many believe the relics of the temple still rest. The mystery is not limited to gold. Medieval and Renaissance accounts claim that the Templars possessed objects of incalculable spiritual value, among them the most famous, the Ark of the Covenant, the golden chest that, according to the Old Testament, contained the tablets of the law given to Moses. Some claimed that the Templars had found it during their excavations under the Temple Mount in Jerusalem and had kept it secret. Others spoke of the Saint Grail, the chalice used by Christ at the Last Supper, taken to Europe and hidden in a place known only to the Grand Master. The Grail in these versions was not a physical object, but a symbol of divine knowledge that the Order would have protected from the corruption of human power. With the passage of time, these stories were mixed with alchemy, Kabbalah, and the esoteric currents of later Europe. The Templars were associated with occult lore, sacred geometry, and ancient Hermetic traditions. Their link with Solomon's temple made them symbolic heirs to the wisdom of the wise king, builder of the most revered shrine in the ancient world. In the centuries that followed, the secret societies that sprang up in Europe, such as the Rosicrucians or the Freemasons, would claim that spiritual heritage, claiming descent from the Templars and preserving their secrets. Over the centuries, the myth of the Templar treasure adapted to the new eras. In the 18th century, the Enlightenment sought it as a source of lost knowledge. In the 19th century, the Romantics turned it into a symbol of purity and sacrifice. In the 20th century, archaeologists and novelists transformed it into the heart of conspiracies and adventures. The daily life of a Templar life inside the temple was a rigorous mixture of prayer, discipline, and combat. On the surface, their castles were military fortresses, but inside they functioned as true monasteries. Each day began before dawn, when the bell of the Templar convent, the signum, rang out in the stone courtyards. The knights woke up immediately, dressed without saying a word, and went to the chapel for the prayer of matins. Their days were governed by a strict schedule, determined by the rule of the temple, which established when they had to pray, work, train, and eat. In that perfect structure, there was no room for improvisation or leisure. The Templars were monks and soldiers at the same time. They swore to obey 3 unbreakable vows: poverty, chastity, and obedience. Their clothes were simple, like white woolen tunics with the Red Cross embroidered on their chests, and they had to be kept clean as a sign of spiritual purity. They slept clothed with the belt of their sword at hand, ready to mount at any moment. Their beds were hard, covered with rough blankets. The dormitories were shared and cold, with no fire or decorations. Each knight possessed only the bare necessities: a habit, a cloak, a knife, a belt, and a horse. Any superfluous object was considered an offense to his vow of poverty. The day was divided between prayer and training. They prayed 7 times a day, following the rhythm of the divine office, interspersed with biblical readings with moments of absolute silence. After morning prayer, military training began. The Templars practiced hand-to-hand combat, the use of the spear, the bow, and the sword. Every move had to be executed with precision. Discipline was the essence of their strength. A single Templar could face multiple enemies without breaking formation. They trained to remain calm even under a hail of arrows. The rule was clear. The Knight of the Temple is not afraid of dying, he is afraid to disobey. On the battlefield, the organization was perfect. The knights formed the vanguard, followed by the sergeants and the squires. The bowshant banner, half white and half black, guided his movements. None of them were to retreat while the banner was still standing. If it fell, someone else had to pick it up immediately. Defeat was not an option, and abandonment of the field was punishable by expulsion from the order. For this reason, the Templars were feared by both the Muslims and the Crusaders themselves. They fought in silence, without mercy or doubt. His faith was his armor. Outside of combat, Templar life followed a monastic order. Meals were frugal: bread, legumes, water, and light wine. Meat was served only on appointed days. During the meal, silence reigned. One brother reader recited scriptures while the others ate. It was forbidden to talk, laugh, or murmur. Whoever broke the norm had to confess and do penance. Every act, from prayer to eating, had a spiritual purpose: to subdue the body, to strengthen the soul. The hierarchy within the temple was strict. At the top was the Grand Master, elected by a council of dignitaries. Under his command were the provincial masters, responsible for the commanderies of Europe and the East. Each castle or Templar house had a commander in charge of administering the lands, resources, and discipline. The Knights Templar, nobles by birth, were the elite force. The sergeants, of humble origins, served as military and administrative support. The brother chaplains were in charge of the masses and sacraments. Finally, the squires and servants fulfilled domestic and logistical tasks. All, without exception, obeyed the orders of the immediate superior as if they came from God. The rule also contemplated the spiritual life. Each Templar was required to go to confession frequently, attend daily mass, and maintain a life of constant prayer. Gambling, vain oaths, and the company of women were forbidden. Chastity was an absolute obligation. Any suspicious contact with a woman, even a prolonged gaze, could imply expulsion. The order was considered a spiritual family where there was no earthly love, only devotion to the Creator and the brotherhood of the temple. The punishments were severe. A Templar who disobeyed could be forced to eat on the ground, stripped of his cloak, or confined in isolation. Serious crimes, such as cowardice or treason, were paid for with expulsion or death. However, forgiveness was always possible through public penance. Some knights, guilty of having fled in combat, returned voluntarily years later, barefoot and dressed in rags, asking to be whipped before the community before being readmitted. Shame was his redemption. In the hours of rest, the Templars spent time repairing their weapons, writing reports, or working the land. Many were skilled builders, architects, and blacksmiths. Defensive innovations, bridges, and hydraulic systems were designed in its fortresses. Templar architecture combined military efficiency with spirituality. The round churches, inspired by the Holy Sepulchre in Jerusalem, reminded the knight that his mission was to protect the heart of the faith. The circular shape, without beginning or end, symbolized the eternity of God. Despite the austerity, the camaraderie ran deep. The brothers shared everything: food, horse, and danger. The rule forbade envy and pride. Each knight was to love his brother as himself. Before leaving for battle, they would confess together and ask forgiveness from each other. They believed that to die without reconciliation was to die in sin. Their strength was based on this fraternity. They did not fight for individual glory, but as a single will consecrated to heaven. Enemies and rivalries. The temple's power, discipline, and absolute autonomy soon aroused enmity. In the turbulent medieval world, where kingdoms rose and fell under the weight of wars and intrigues, no institution could achieve such influence without provoking suspicion. The Templars, loyal only to the Pope, were an army beyond the control of the monarchs. Their wealth and their network of fortresses spread throughout Europe made them a state within states. And while in the Holy Land they fought against Islam, in the West they accumulated more dangerous enemies: jealousy, envy, and political power. On the battlefield, his main rivals were other Christian military orders, also born in the heat of the Crusades. Among them were the Knights Hospitaller, known for running hospitals and protecting pilgrims, and the Teutonic Knights, who emerged from the Germanic tradition. At first, Templars and Hospitallers fought shoulder to shoulder, sharing common ideals and enemies. However, over time, the differences became apparent. The Hospitallers, less rigid and more charitable, began to compete for the same resources and donations that supported the temple. Disputes over territories, castles, and revenues multiplied, especially in the Crusader cities of Acre, Tripoli, and Antioch. The chroniclers of the time record clashes between the two orders that went beyond spiritual rivalry. In 1258, in the city of Acre, tensions reached an extreme. Templars and Hospitallers clashed in the streets with drawn swords. The dead and wounded were numerous. That scandal embarrassed the Pope, who ordered a forced reconciliation between the masters of both orders. But the wounds did not heal. Since then, alliances in the East have become unstable. Each order defended its own strategic interests, and internal rivalries weakened the Christian defense against the common enemy. The Templars also had friction with the Teutonics, whose expansion into northern Europe, in campaigns against Baltic pagans, imitated their military and spiritual model. Although the Teutonics respected the temple as their antecedent, their territorial ambition generated suspicion. In Jerusalem, the Templars considered them a young and arrogant order. Tensions between the three great Christian militias were constant, and their differences in customs, languages, and hierarchies made any coordination on the battlefield difficult. In theory, they all served the same faith. In practice, they competed for the glory and favor of the Pope. In the East, the Templars faced a more formidable enemy, unified Islam under Saladin. After decades of fragmented fighting, Muslim forces began to act under a single banner. The Kurdish Sultan's military genius and religious determination marked the beginning of the end for the Crusader kingdoms. The Templars distinguished themselves by their bravery in battles such as the Battle of Montgisard in 1177, where they defeated an army far superior in numbers, but they also suffered devastating defeats, such as the Battle of Hattin in 1187, where hundreds of knights fell. Templar prisoners were publicly executed for refusing to renounce their faith. That defeat opened the door to the loss of Jerusalem. After the fall of the Holy City, the Templars retreated to Acre, their last great fortress in the Holy Land. From there they continued to defend the Crusader territories for nearly a century, but his enemies did not cease to multiply. As the fervor of the Crusades faded in Europe, donations to the order dwindled and criticism mounted. Kings and nobles, tired of financing distant wars, began to see in the Templars an unnecessary expense, an army that no longer served its original purpose. Muslim chroniclers, on the other hand, described them with a mixture of respect and hatred. To many Saracens, the Templars were the bravest and most stubborn of the Crusaders. Neither the promise of ransom nor the threat of torture would make them renounce their faith. When captured, they preferred to die rather than be converted. That unwavering conviction made them enemies feared and admired alike. In medieval Islamic imagery, the Templars were seen as lions from hell, warriors who fought beyond fear and reason. Within Christendom itself, however, respect began to erode. Tensions with the local nobility and secular clergy intensified. Many bishops criticized its independence and immunity from civil laws. In some places, the Templars were accused of acting as feudal lords, administering justice and collecting taxes on behalf of the order. Their authority, backed directly by the Pope, made them untouchable. The kings needed them, but they also feared them. His power was a double-edged sword. The most dangerous rivalry for the Temple arose in France, where its financial power began to eclipse that of the crown itself. The Templars were creditors of King Philip IV the Fair, a proud and ambitious monarch who saw in them both a threat and a solution to his debts. Philip, indebted by wars and his luxurious court, understood that as long as the Temple existed, its authority would be limited. Their resentment grew quietly, fueled by envy and financial need. What began as a strategic alliance between the crown and the order would eventually morph into brutal persecution. Meanwhile, in the east, the Templars continued to lose ground. The fall of Acre in 1291 marked the end of the Crusader states. The survivors took refuge in Cyprus, where they kept the structure of the order alive, but its raison d'etre, i.e. the defense of the Holy Land, had been extinguished. The enemies who had once stalked them from the deserts of Palestine now awaited them in European palaces. The spears that had held out against the Saracens would soon face a more cunning and lethal enemy, the political power of the Christian kings. The fall of Jerusalem and the end of the Crusades. The year 1187 marked the beginning of the end of the Crusader dream. After almost a century of Christian rule in the Holy Land, the walls of Jerusalem fell back into the hands of Islam. The defeat was not sudden, but the result of years of decline, internal rivalries and overconfidence. The Templars, who had been the shield of Eastern Christendom, found themselves facing an enemy that was stronger, more united and guided by a faith as powerful as their own. That enemy had a name, Salah ad-Din Yusuf ibn Ayyub, known in the West as Saladin. Saladin had succeeded in unifying the Muslim forces of Egypt and Syria under his command. His military genius and religious piety inspired both his soldiers and his adversaries. In the summer of 1187, his armies advanced into Galilee, where the Crusader forces, led by King Guy of Lusignan, the Templar Grand Master Gérard de Riedfort, and the Grand Master of the Hospitallers, Roger de Moulins, came out to meet him. Under an unrelenting sun, on a plain near Mount Hattin, the Christian hosts were surrounded and annihilated. Thousands of knights were killed or captured. The relics of the cross were taken by the enemy. Jerusalem was left defenseless. When Saladin entered the city on October 2, 1187, there was no massacre or looting. Unlike the Crusaders of 1099, the Sultan allowed the Christians to leave the city in exchange for a ransom. For the Templars, the loss of Jerusalem was a devastating spiritual blow. For decades, they had believed they were fighting for the will of God, for the defense of the Holy Sepulchre, and now the Holy City was once again in the hands of Islam. Their mission seemed to have failed, but the order was not dissolved. They withdrew their forces to Acre, where they erected a new see. From there, they planned the counterattack. Pope Gregory VIII called for a new crusade to recapture Jerusalem. It was the Third Crusade, between 1189 and 1192, led by three of the greatest monarchs of the time, Richard the Lionheart of England, Philip II Augustus of France, and Emperor Frederick Barbarossa of the Holy Roman Empire. The Templars joined the English army, accompanying Richard on his march through Palestine. They fought at Acre, Arsuf, and Jaffa, demonstrating their legendary discipline. At the Battle of Arsuf, his final charge allowed the Crusaders to win, forcing Saladin to retreat. However, Jerusalem was never recovered. The treaty signed in 1192 allowed Christian pilgrims to visit the city, but under Muslim sovereignty. It was an incomplete victory. Over the next few centuries, the Crusades continued, but their spirit faded. What had begun as an enterprise of faith morphed into a succession of political campaigns, marked by ambition and greed. The Templars continued to fight in the east, but each crusade was weaker than the previous one. In the Fourth Crusade in 1204, Christian armies did not even reach the Holy Land. They sacked Constantinople, the capital of Eastern Christianity. That deviation from the original purpose was the symbol of a lost cause. The temple, however, did not disappear. He adapted his role to the new scenario. From its base in Acre, the order became the main defensive force of the later Crusader kingdoms. Its castles, such as Castelblanc, Tortosa, and the imposing Crac of the Knights, resisted the Muslim onslaught for years. Each fortress was a small, self-sufficient city supplied by European encomiendas. The Templars perfected fortification techniques, erecting double walls, semicircular towers, and in-depth defense systems. Its architecture would later inspire European castles. But time was against him. The fervor of the Crusades in Europe was fading, and kings were no longer willing to finance distant wars. The papacy was losing influence, and the Templars, without a visible cause, were beginning to be seen as an uncomfortable relic. Despite their isolated victories, Muslim pressure intensified. In 1291, the armies of Sultan al-Ashraf Khalil, Saladin's successor, laid siege to Acre, the last Christian stronghold in the Holy Land. The defense was fierce. The Templars resisted until the last moment, fighting house by house, street by street. Grandmaster Guillaume de Beaujeu fell mortally wounded on the walls of the city. His last words were, "Brethren, I defend Christ, not the stone." When the walls finally gave way, the city was razed to the ground. Thousands of crusaders died, and the Templars who survived were either executed or enslaved. With the fall of Acre, Christendom lost its last stronghold in the east. It was the end of the Crusades. The few Templars who escaped took refuge in Cyprus, where they established a new headquarters. From there, they maintained their structure and hierarchy, preserving their archives, treasures, and symbols. But the spirit of the order had changed. There was no longer any Holy Land to defend, nor pilgrims to escort. Their castles in Europe were still active, their encomiendas continued to produce wealth, but their original mission had disappeared. Without external enemies, they began to arouse the distrust of the monarchs who previously revered them. The fall of Jerusalem was not only a military defeat, but the beginning of a new stage, that of the Temple as a power without a cause. With no crusades to justify their existence, the Knights Templar became custodians of a past glory. In France, England, Spain, and Portugal, their fortresses stood as witnesses of a time when faith moved armies. But in the silence of its chapels, under the worn banners, a new danger was brewing: suspicion. The same power that had raised them above kings was beginning to turn against them. The last knight to leave the ruins of Acre bore on his chest the red cross of the temple, and in his eyes the certainty that an era had ended. Behind it was the dust of Jerusalem, the echo of the Crusades and the end of the Holy War. The trial against the Templars. On the morning of October 13, 1307, throughout the territory of France, the bailiffs of King Philip IV the Fair received a secret order. Before dawn, they were to simultaneously break into all the Templar houses of the kingdom and arrest each of their members. That date would mark the beginning of the end of the Order of the Temple. The blow was accurate, fast, and devastating. Hundreds of Templars were captured without resistance. The papal seals that protected them from any secular power were worthless in the face of the will of the most powerful king in Europe. Philip IV had been plotting his revenge for years. The French monarchy was up to its neck in debt to the order, which had financed its wars and sustained its economy. The Templars were his creditors, but also his rivals. They controlled vast lands, fleets, and fortifications, and answered only to the Pope. Their independence was intolerable. Philip needed money, and he needed a visible enemy to justify his ambition. Thus, the Temple, without crusades, without military purpose, and with hidden treasures, became the perfect target. The king ordered a list of accusations to be drawn up that mixed superstition, heresy, and politics. The Templars were accused of worshipping idols, denying Christ, spitting on the cross, practicing blasphemous rituals, and committing impure acts in their secret ceremonies. They were also charged with idolatry, witchcraft, and sodomy, charges common in heresy trials of the time. They were absurd accusations, but enough to ignite the anger of the people and obtain the support of a church fearful of confronting the French monarch. The Grand Master of the Temple, Jacques de Molay, was arrested along with other high dignitaries: Hugues de Perrot, Geoffroy de Gonville, Geoffroy de Charnay, and Jean de la Tour. They were all taken to Paris and locked up in damp dungeons, held incommunicado, and subjected to interrogations under torture. The inquisitors, appointed by the king himself, extracted confessions that would later be used as proof of guilt. Beaten, burned, and mutilated, many Templars admitted anything that would end the torment. Others died in silence without uttering a word. Pope Clement V, elected years earlier with the support of Philip IV, tried at first to resist the pressure. The temple was a pontifical order, and only Rome had authority over it. But the king's power was absolute. Clemente, installed in Avignon under French influence, he was forced to accept the fait accompli. In 1308, he ordered the suspension of the order until the charges were clarified. Even so, the machinery of the Inquisition was already in motion, and the process spread throughout Europe. In England, Aragon, Castile, Germany, and Portugal, similar interrogations were carried out, although with very different results. In almost all the kingdoms, the Templars were acquitted for lack of evidence. In France, on the other hand, the sentence was already decided. Confessions obtained under torture were presented as irrefutable evidence. The Templars were portrayed as a danger to Christendom, a corrupt sect that had betrayed its divine mission. Philip IV used pulpits to propagate his version. Churches were filled with sermons that spoke of dark rituals and demonic pacts. The people, who had once revered the Knights Templar as holy warriors, began to fear them. In a single political move, the king had destroyed his reputation and taken control of his property. The Templar assets were confiscated and, in theory, handed over to the Order of the Hospitallers according to the subsequent pontifical decision. But in practice, much of the wealth disappeared into the hands of the crown and Philip's noble allies. The encomiendas were looted, the castles occupied, and the archives destroyed. Within months, Europe's most powerful economic network crumbled. The temple, which for 2 centuries had moved armies and fortunes, was reduced to ashes. In 1310, the great public trial began in Paris. More than 500 Templars were brought before the ecclesiastical tribunal. Many, when freed from torture, recanted their confessions. They declared that they had been forced to lie, that they had never denied Christ, and that the accusations were false. The Pope, alarmed, ordered a review of the process. But the king did not wait. 54 Templars who had recanted were burned alive in a field near Paris. Flames devoured their bodies as smoke rose over the city. The message was clear: anyone who opposed the king's power would suffer the same fate. Even so, the process continued. Clement V convened a council at Vienne in 1311 to decide the future of the order. The representatives of the European kingdoms defended the innocence of the Templars, but the Pope, pressured by Philip IV, decreed in 1312 the official dissolution of the Order of the Temple by means of the bull Vox in Excelso. No formal conviction was issued, but the order ceased to exist. Its assets passed to the Hospital of San Juan, and its members were dispersed or integrated into other institutions. Grand Master Jacques de Molay, who had endured 7 years in prison, was finally brought before the court in March 1314. The Templars were taken to the Île aux Juifs, a small island off Notre Dame. Tied to poles, they watched the twilight as the executioner lit the fires. The fire rose slowly, illuminating the river and the towers of Paris. According to the chronicles, before he died, Jacques de Molay cast a curse. God knows who is wrong and who has sinned. Soon he will judge those guilty of our death. A few months later, both Philip IV and Clement V died suddenly, fulfilling the prophecy that sealed the legend of the last Grand Master of the Temple. The execution of Jacques de Molay. On March 18, 1314, the air in Paris was cold and dense. The Seine River, grey and silent, reflected the smoke rising from the banks. On the small Île aux Juifs, in front of Notre Dame Cathedral, 2 chained figures awaited their fate. They were Jacques de Molay, the last Grand Master of the Order of the Temple, and Geoffroy de Charnay, preceptor of Normandy. The crowd crowded on the bridges, walls, and barges of the river. No one wanted to miss the end of Christ's army. The man who had led the Templars for 22 years was about to burn. Molay had spent the last 7 years in prison, between interrogations and torture. Since his arrest in 1307, he had remained composed, refusing to renounce his faith or betray his brothers. During the trial, he had been pressured to accept the charges of heresy and blasphemy, confessions obtained under torture. In 1314, when Pope Clement V and King Philip IV decided to definitively close the case, the fate of the order was already sealed. The Pope decreed the dissolution of the temple. The king demanded visible justice. The bonfire would be the last chapter. On the morning of their execution, Molay and de Charnay were brought before the judges in the Place du Parvis, opposite the cathedral. The prelates, representatives of the Pope, read the sentence: life imprisonment for heresy. It was a punishment that would have saved his life. But Molay, standing emaciated and covered in rags, did the unthinkable. He stepped forward, interrupted the reading, and spoke in a firm voice. He declared that confessions obtained under torture were false, that the Templars were innocent, and that the order had faithfully served Christ. Before a stunned crowd, he proclaimed, "I have sinned by lying. My soul cannot depart falsely. The order of the temple is pure. We are innocent." That act sealed his fate. The legacy of the temple, which the king had tried to erase with propaganda and fear, was reborn at that moment in the figure of its last master. The judges were paralyzed. The old gentleman's words thwarted the whole process. Philip IV, upon learning of it, reacted with fury. He ordered Molay and de Charnay to be burned immediately without the possibility of appeal. The stake was to silence forever the man who had defied the throne and the papacy in a single gesture. In the evening, the Templars were driven by boat to the small island. The executioners had already prepared the stakes and the firewood. The sky turned red over the Seine, as if presaging the end of an era. Molay, bent over by the years and the tortures, asked for only one thing: that he be tied facing Notre Dame, to die in front of the face of the Virgin. Witnesses said he accepted his fate with serenity. He refused the confessor's forgiveness and asked to pray in silence. Geoffroy de Charnay, at his side, did the same. None showed fear. The torches touched the pyre. The flames rose slowly, devouring the wet firewood. Smoke engulfed the figures of the knights, but Molay's voice could still be heard amid the screams of the audience. God knows who is wrong and who has sinned. Soon he will judge those who condemn us. It was the curse of the last Templar. According to the chronicles, his words resounded with supernatural clarity, as if they were a divine sentence. The fire consumed them completely while the sun set over Paris. The silence that followed was as deep as the story that had just ended. A few months later, the prophecy began to be fulfilled. In April 1314, just 33 days after the execution, Clement V died in Avignon, the victim of a sudden illness. His body, placed in a chapel for the wake, was struck by lightning that set fire to the coffin. In November of the same year, Philip IV fell from his horse during a hunt and died abruptly. The two men responsible for the destruction of the temple had perished in the same year. For many, this was not a coincidence, but God's judgment. With Molay's death, the Order of the Temple officially disappeared. Their assets were absorbed by the Knights Hospitaller, their fortresses sold or destroyed, and their symbols banned. But nothing could erase his mark. In the following decades, rumours of surviving Templars multiplied. Some were said to have fled to Scotland, where they fought alongside Robert the Bruce at the Battle of Bannockburn. Others would have escaped to Portugal, where they were welcomed by King Dinis under the new name of Order of Christ. From then on, the idea that the temple had not completely disappeared began to form part of the myth. Medieval chroniclers describe Molay's final scene with words of admiration and fear. Some called him a martyr, others considered him the last true knight. His death, more than an ending, was the beginning of a legend. In the following centuries, his figure would be vindicated by writers, mystics, and secret societies who would see in him a symbol of resistance against the corruption of power. The image of the old maester, standing in the flames looking at Notre Dame, was etched in the memory of Europe. In the silence after the bonfire, when the smoke cleared over the Seine, witnesses claimed to have seen the embers form a cross. Some took it as a divine sign, others as an illusion of twilight. But for those who believed in the innocence of the temple, that fire did not destroy the order, but purified it. Its symbol, the red cross on the white mantle, would continue to appear for centuries in churches, manuscripts, and coats of arms. The history of the temple ended there, but its shadow would continue to live on in memory and mystery. On March 18, 1314, when the flames consumed Jacques de Molay, more than a man burned with him. The last fire of the Crusades was extinguished, the echo of an era in which faith had armed knights and raised empires. The temple disappeared on earth, but in history it remained eternal as the emblem of a promise that was never forgotten.